Hi, we're going to be going through Chapter 8, which is on listening. Listening is one of the most important chapters that you can learn from because you will spend the most amount of time in your life and in your career as a student and in your career at your job listening. Listening is an aspect of communication that we often take for granted. We think that people should be able to listen well and get frustrated when they cannot. And yet listening is something that very few of us get specific training on. So it's an important chapter. It's something that's directly linked to your satisfaction at work, to your satisfaction in your relationships, and to your ability to be a good parent and mentor in your overall environment. So let's get started with some definitions. Listening is defined as the process of making sense of other people's spoken messages. And we do know that we spend more time listening to than any other type of communication. And in fact, in college, they've studied this and said that it's up to 80% of your time that will be spent listening. Your listening skills will determine your success in your relationships, the level of career advancement, and the degree of leadership that you'll obtain. And there's a difference between mindless listening and mindful listening. And this has to do with the difference between hearing and listening overall, where hearing is an automatic process that just happens because your ears are wired to take in those audio waves. Listening is a conscious interpretation of what you hear. So just because I'm speaking to you right now doesn't mean that you are going to process the sound waves that are coming into your ear. You might hear those sound waves, but it doesn't mean that you've listened to what I've said. So mindless listening and mindful listening help explain why sometimes we don't make sense of the sound waves. Mindless listening is when we're processing messages without a lot of mental investment. And so we're just quickly getting it in, and then it gets out the door just as fast as it comes. This is where like your short-term memory takes place. So it's just a mindless sort of thing where the information comes and you might nod your head or something, but it doesn't stick for very long. And then mindful listening is when we have careful thought and attention given to the subject matter or the person that we're speaking. And in order to be mindfully listening and mindfully engaged, you have to non-verbally be present with the person. So this means that your facial expressions, your eye contact, your body language is all facing towards them, and perhaps even doing some of those mirroring techniques that we talked about, where you are showing that you're trying to take in the information that they are speaking, not just from their words, but from their nonverbals as well. And then the second part of being a mindful listener is really trying to challenge yourself to keep your bias and that internal chatter that would be evaluating or judging what they're saying to a minimum. Instead of being there to hear what your response might be there to listen to what they're actually saying. And that's what makes a mindful listener. So now let's go through the listening process. The listening process has 5 different steps, starting with hearing, then attending, then understanding, responding, and finally remembering. And in the first process for listening is hearing. And remember, hearing is just allowing those sound waves to enter into your ear canal so that they can connect to the brain and you have a chance to understand what that sound or those words mean. So this might mean that you have to turn off the television, unplug your earphones, or turn up the volume on something so that you can actually hear them. But that obviously would be the first step. The second thing is to attend to what you're hearing. And like I just said with mindless listening, we don't always attend to the information that our ears are processing. So, for example, you might be used to the sound of streetcars outside of your window or a train, and you don't even hear that noise anymore. You do hear it, right? Because the sound waves are still coming into your brain, but it has learned not to attend to that information, and so you don't notice it anymore. So actually noticing the information and attending to it is part of the second process. This is also part of that nonverbal addressing of what it is that you're hearing. So non-verbally mirroring and matching the person that's talking to you helps you to better be able to attend to what their message is. The third is to understand that message. This means that you have to process what they're saying and somehow have a place in your brain to store that information. If you don't have a place to understand it and store it, then chances are it'll go in one ear and out the other, if you've heard that saying before. So you need to somehow have something built in your mind for this person or the experience so that you can understand what it is that they're talking about. The fourth step is to respond. Notice that many of us will respond earlier. It's, we respond as we are perhaps trying to figure something out or trying to understand. But we really should wait for our response until after. We should wait until we know that we have a firm understanding and give them a chance to speak. This helps us to keep our egos at bay and to really put the speaker in the position that they need to be and take the role of the listener seriously. And then the fifth is to remember. It doesn't do a lot of good to attend to information and understand it and actually respond to them if you don't remember that information in the future and take it into account. So this has to do with building categories in your brain and knowing how to store the information that you hear. In a class, you might hear a lot of information from a lecture, and chances are very, if you're like a typical college student, little of the information automatically sticks. It's through conscious effort that a lecture material would stay with you and be processed in your brain for later. And you have to treat your brain kind of like a filing cabinet, so you have a place for information automatically to go. And then when you hear that information, you attend to it, you understand what it is, and you form a response. You have a connection and a wiring of sorts for that to be stored so that you will remember that conversation later and learn from it. If any of us have ever felt frustrated in a marriage before, for example, not feeling like your side or your perspective was heard, it's probably that you don't feel like they remembered what you were saying or that they didn't take it to heart. And that taking to heart has to do with remembering. There's a lot of different types of ineffective listening, and your book brings up quite a few for you to consider, starting with pseudo-listening. Pseudo-listening is when you fake listen. So you might be on the phone or even in a face-to-face context, and your head will nod, and you might even say sounds like, uh-huh, oh yeah, but nothing is registering. You're literally not going beyond the first step of hearing the material. So you pretend like you're listening, but you really aren't. Those of us who have been pseudo-listened to know that that's extremely frustrating, to be talking to someone and know that they're just fake listening back. The second is selective listening. Selective listening is where we pay attention to certain parts of a message but leave other parts out. Usually the parts that we pay attention to are the ones that we have some sort of a bias about, either because we think that it relates to us or because we think that it relates to something that we have an opinion about. And so we hear parts of the message and not others. Ambushing is where we interrupt, and when someone brings up something, instead of hearing the whole message out, your response will come right in and become front and center for what should be talked about. So you steal the stage of sorts and make the issue about yourself or whatever it is that you're feeling. Insensitive listening is when we hear, but we don't hear empathetically. So we're listening, we go through the process, we even understand, but when it gets down to the understanding, we don't have a place in our brain of empathy for this person. So they might be telling you about their latest breakup, but you have a place in your brain where you process their last 5 breakups. And because you feel like they're doing something maybe that they shouldn't be doing or that they haven't been taking their relationship seriously, your response becomes insensitive. And as soon as it hits that part of the brain that says, oh, it's this again, then suddenly we go into that other train of thought, which does tend to be insensitive. When we feel like we've been listened to in an insensitive way, it becomes offensive. The next is stage hogging. Some people have the desire to make things about themselves every time. So they will listen to what you're saying, but they're listening with the idea that they can somehow take that information and either one-up it with their own story or twist it to somehow reflect them at the end. So this is when egos are really clear and present, that we would have a lot of stage hogging. Defensive listening is when you listen for something so that you know how to hit back. So when you're defensive listening, it's just as if you were in a boxing match and you have your gloves up ready to defend yourself if somebody comes at you. That's how it is when you listen from this perspective. So the information doesn't really get channeled in a way that would have like an openness for either side to somehow consider. The information is presented in a way that the listener feels like they have to look for specific material that they could take and then use to hit back. Insulated listening is when a listener isn't able to hear certain material, so perhaps they don't want to break up with you, and so every time you bring up information that might kind of hint towards that, they'll insulate themselves away from that information and literally not hear it. So it's kind of like selective listening, where they're only hearing parts of it, but it's for the purpose of protecting themselves and not facing things that perhaps they'd want to face. The reason that we don't listen better are many. There are many reasons why. So there's message overload. We're bombarded with messages throughout the day, especially since now we are plugged into our cell phones for pretty much our whole life. We are preoccupied with a lot of different things, going to school, our own relationships, our children, just the stress and fatigue of what we're going through. So it makes it hard to completely attend to somebody else when you know you have attending to do to yourself or to your own thought processes. We have rapid thought to deal with, and rapid thought is where like spare brain time comes in. If you've ever had a public speaking class, they probably brought this up. But our brains are able to process much quicker than the average person speaks. And so that opens up your brain's ability to start that inner voice that can take you off into a totally different direction. So, somebody's telling you about their boyfriend, and all of a sudden in your mind you start thinking about lunch. And that's because you can literally listen and think about two different things. So the effort that it takes to really listen to somebody is another reason why we don't listen better. And some people we just don't prioritize as being worth the effort that it would take. So in our social circle, we tend to have up to about 6 people that we form strong bonds with. And with those 6 people, we probably really try to put effort in. But when you expand out into the 30 or so that are part of our social structure and our social relationships, it gets harder to listen to all of them. We just don't have time, and the effort that it takes is more than perhaps what we have to give. A lot of times there's external noise to deal with. And this could be something with your environment that is as little as like the heat. If it's too hot, it's hard to listen. If it's too cold, or it could be like a literal noise or something or smell that's coming from outside. We have faulty assumptions about what people are probably meaning, and this has to do with our relationship. Remember, all messages have a content and relationship dimension. A lot of times, no matter what they say, if the relationship is speaking something else to us, those faulty assumptions about what we think that message is will bleed into what they're saying. So regardless if they say those words or not, that's what we're listening. That's what our mindful listening is telling us. We have lack of apparent advantages. Sometimes it just doesn't seem like it's worth the effort for that person, and that's the self-serving bias coming out. We have a lack of training. A lot of people never get a training in listening. In fact, if you don't have a communication class, chances are you would never get one in college. And yet it's something that you will spend the majority of your time doing. So there's definitely a lack of training. There could be hearing problems. So this is something that you would need to see an audiologist about. And there could be media influences telling you perhaps that a particular gender doesn't need to listen to a certain thing. Men don't need to listen to relationship issues, or women don't need to listen to conversations about politics. Those are both stereotypes, as we know, but that is reinforced in the media, and sometimes it just creates this sort of loop, an ability to excuse yourself from different listening habits. So if you want to listen better, there's a couple of things that you can do. Right at the top, you need to talk less. Just mindfully tell yourself when you go into a conversation to stay less vocal. Keep your internal chatter to a minimum and try to talk less. Just by doing that, that's going to help you focus on the other person. The other thing that you can do in the middle is to eliminate distractions overall. So perhaps somebody's trying to talk to you and you haven't even had a chance to walk in the door and get a bite to eat after a long day at work. Perhaps your children or your whatever it is that you're doing at home with your job or your school is taking up your focus at that moment. Be willing to say directly that you need to wait and talk to them in a minute when you get to a better place. So otherwise you are going to be trying to listen to somebody when you automatically have distractions that will make that hard. So the other thing you can do is try not to judge prematurely. We do have places in our brain, that's part of that understanding step, which have been built over time based off of experiences that we've heard from or seen from other people. So it makes it hard not to judge because you have this bank of knowledge about situations like that. However, as we all know, we are all unique and each situation is unique. And so if we go automatically to that judgment, it tends to turn our minds off to being able to listen to what might be different. And we feel like we have the answer, so we don't need to hear much more. And then the last thing to do is to listen for key ideas. And know that you won't be able to hear every word. This has to do with school especially. As you go into a class, you'll have a lot of information presented to you, and you need to look for those key ideas and process that. Try to create a place in your brain for those key ideas, and then it'll be easier to hear and listen to information that relates to that. There are some different listening responses that you can choose for different scenarios, and we're going to go through that now. There's prompting, questioning, paraphrasing, supporting, analyzing, advising, and judging. So let's start with prompting. Prompting is when you use silences and brief statements of encouragement to draw other people out, so to help them find their own response. Prompting can be a catalyst to help other people find their own answers, and it is only effective if it's genuinely given. So an example of prompting would be to sit down in a conversation and just use really brief words like, really, wow, and just silence to make them continue to speak. Try this out. People are uncomfortable with silence, and if you'll just stay quiet, they'll feel like they need to talk more. So that would be prompting. The next one is questions. And with questions, remember that sincere questions are beneficial, but counterfeit questions are aimed at sending a particular message all of their own, and they are not beneficial in the listening realm. So sincere questions are beneficial, but stay away from counterfeit questions. So a sincere question might be, as you're prompting someone, really, you might want to follow it up with a listening question response of, how did that make you feel? Or what did you find out? And questions like that really don't have a loaded response do tend to be beneficial for people to consider, because it helps them just go deeper into their own analysis and to figure out what's going on. Counterfeit questions would be like a tag question, such as, you didn't like that movie, did you? Or, don't you think that he would make a good boss? Both of those are examples of where it leads someone to perhaps say a certain response. It doesn't feel as open. It feels like you would have to defend yourself if you didn't agree with them. Questions that make statements are also counterfeit questions, such as, are you finally off the phone? That's making the statement that you feel like they've been on the phone for a long time. Questions that carry a hidden agenda. Are you busy Friday night? Well, what do you want to do Friday night? That's the question. Are you busy? And you ask them that because you want them to babysit your kids, or because you want to go out with them, so like there's a hidden agenda of some sort. Questions that seek correct answers are counterfeit questions. So, honey, do you think that I look ugly, or do I look fat in this dress? Those questions have one answer. There's one answer that you're supposed to give when your wife or a girlfriend or a sister asks you that. The last is questions based on unchecked assumptions. So, why aren't you listening to me? Would be a really good example of an assumption that they haven't been listening. Or, why don't you care? So, try to stay away from questions that lead people and just use positive questions. The next listening response is paraphrasing, and paraphrasing is an active tool that you can use. It's active listening where you restate in your own words the message that you heard. It's not direct parroting. Parroting would mean that you word for word parrot back what they say. Paraphrasing changes the speaker's wording in your response, and you should offer some sort of an example of what you think the speaker is talking about. So you'll change their wording and offer an example, and then reflect on the underlying theme of the speaker's remarks for why they might be saying what they're saying, or what you could learn from that. So all of that shows that you are doing some deeper processing with what you hear. And it requires you to keep your ego out of it, to keep judgment out of it, because you use the first basis of their own words and an example that you think reflect what they're talking about before you ever try to discover any sort of a theme. So paraphrasing can be very effective. Before you paraphrase, though, be very careful to make sure that the issue is complex enough to address this. You might not have the necessary time and concern to put into what it is that you're discovering. So be careful, because if you start paraphrasing and opening up that can of worms to just shut the lid back, could be more offensive than not asking in the first place. Ask yourself if you can withhold judgment, because if you can't withhold judgment, then that last step, that step of reflecting the underlying theme of the speaker's remarks, is going to be pretty loaded. So if you can't withhold judgment, don't paraphrase. And then the last is your paraphrasing in proportion to the other responses that have been given, or is this kind of out of the blue? So it takes a deeper type of relationship and connection to be able to paraphrase each other. Otherwise, you don't really know enough about them to start going into this deeper level. So the next listening response is supporting. There's empathizing, agreement, offers to help, praise, and reassurance. So these are all supporting types of responses to make. An empathizing response might be, yeah, that class was tough for me too. An agreement might be, sounds like that job is a perfect match for you. An offer to help, I'd be happy to study with you for the next test. A praise, you are a terrific person, even if she doesn't recognize it. And a reassurance, I am sure that you'll do a great job. If we can pepper our responses with supportive responses, that tends to open up the door for us to do other sorts of work later. So very few people want to be judged or analyzed before they feel supported. And support is an active position. It's something that you have to consciously do. You have to set aside your bias and be able to respond in a way that would provide what that person would deem support. So it's easier said than done, and it's definitely meant for more important relationships. The next listening response is analyzing. Analyzing responses will contain an interpretation of the speaker's message. So you will offer your interpretation as tentative rather than an absolute fact if you want it to be accepted. You need to have or at least a reasonable chance of being correct before you say anything. You ought to be sure that the other person will be receptive to what you're saying before you open your mouth, and you need to make sure that your motive for offering the analysis is truly to help the other person and not to get your agenda across. So if you can meet those 4 boxes, then go ahead and think and do an analysis. Usually the speaker will say, what do you think I should do? Or what would you do in my position? And in those instances, you know it's inviting you to consider analysis. But beware, because sometimes people will say, what would you do? And they really don't want to know. They really don't. So they'll ask it, and then you'll start to tell them, and then they'll be like, oh, here you go, tell me what I should do again. So be careful with analyzing, and make sure that those 4 things are present before you start engaging in that listening response. One step up from that would be advising. Advising responses are where you are going to help them somehow by offering a solution. And you can use this as long as the following 4 conditions are met. So you are advising and telling them specifically what they should do. Not just what I would do in the situation, but this is what I think you need to do. So if the the communication encounter requires a listening response, these 4 things should be present. 1, the advice should have a reasonable chance of being accurate. So that means you need to have had a lot of experience with what you're talking about, and this isn't just some sort of an educated guess. 2, the person needs to seem willing to accept it. So advice is definitely a step up from an analysis. An analysis is just, this is the way I'm processing it. Advice is telling them what they possibly should do. So you need to make sure that they're willing and able to accept what you're saying before you lay that out there for them. Or else you might just be giving them a situation where they're going to fail and feel worse in the long run. The third is that the receiver isn't going to blame you if the advice doesn't work. And that's really important, especially in our interpersonal relationships that we care a lot about. So think about like parent-children relationships, and the mom tells the daughter what she needs to do, and the daughter, first of all, didn't even really want to know, doesn't feel like the mom has an accurate understanding of what's going on. She lays out what she wants her to do. The daughter's just going to be waiting to see if it will actually happen. And as soon as there's any hints that it's not going to happen, that teenage daughter's probably going to go back and blame the mother. So this sounds like I'm talking about my own kids, which I do have teenage daughters, and I do see this a lot. And I did it myself. So I've also seen this in friendships and in romantic relationships. It's the same. You have to be very careful, or it'll open up the door for you to be blamed if it doesn't work out. The fourth thing is that your advice has to be delivered in a supportive, faith-saving manner. So whatever that means, you have to first establish that rapport of support, and you've got to have an exit strategy. So if it doesn't work out, you know that both you and them can have a faith-saving manner. That this was just a try, it was a shot in the dark. You know, there's not going to be any harm or foul if it doesn't work out. The last listening response is judging, and judging responses will evaluate the sender's thoughts or behaviors in some way, and this will either be favorable or unfavorable. So it's an evaluation of sorts, and you get to decide kind of the way that you think things are laying out. Judging is going to imply that you have the qualifications to pass the judgment on the speaker, and will have the best chance of being received if the person with the problem first requests the evaluation from you to the intent of your judgment was genuinely constructive and not designed as a put down. Now I want you to think of how many times in your life you can think of actually wanting to be judged. Can you think on your hand of at least 5? I'll bet you can't. I'll bet even if I gave you a half an hour, you could not think of 5 different occurrences in your life where you wanted to be judged. Now, there are cases, obviously, if you are in competitive sports or if you are in a situation where you need some sort of direct critical feedback, you would ask for it. You would get a coach. You would expect to have that sort of judgment. But even then, is coaching the same thing as judging? Maybe, maybe not. So be very careful with judgment. Judgment is something that can be extremely offensive. And I mean, there are scriptures, there are songs, there's all sorts of material in our world that tell us that we should avoid judging other people. And this is because it has a high likelihood of not being true. It's all based on our own perspective. So our perspective will be put into that evaluation or judgment. So it might have a level of truth, but to be completely true, that's really hard to do. It's really hard to completely judge another person correctly and truthfully. So judgment appears last for a reason. I would be very wary of judgment. Even somebody that says to you, if they ever did, go ahead, judge me. Judge me, am I a good person or a bad person? A, they probably don't really mean that they want your honest assessment there. And B, that's a plea for help is what it sounds like. Not like they really want you to tell them something and they're going to take that into heart. If you're a judge, or maybe there's something where you do have to step in and put your evaluation down, then by all means judgment is an option. But try to let that be a last resort, just like it appeared last year. So thank you. I'll see you back for Chapter 9.